There is a category of military failure that is so complete, so perfectly symmetrical in its uselessness, that it transcends ordinary incompetence and becomes something almost philosophical, a demonstration not merely of bad planning or poor execution, but of a fundamental disconnection between the world that military planners imagined they were preparing for and the world that actually existed when the moment of truth arrived. France achieved exactly this kind of failure in 1940 with a vehicle that had taken nearly a decade to design and build, that represented the absolute pinnacle of French heavy tank technology, that was so large and so impressive that it had been used for years as a propaganda symbol of French military power, and that managed to be captured by the Germans without firing a single shot in its own defense. Not because it was defeated in battle, but because the men responsible for it made a series of decisions so catastrophically wrong that the most powerful tank France had ever built ended up being destroyed by its own crew to prevent it from falling into enemy hands while sitting on a railway flat car in the middle of nowhere. That vehicle was the Char 2C, and its story is one of the most extraordinary and in its own way most perfectly complete stories of military futility in the entire history of armored warfare. The Char 2C was born from the particular kind of military thinking that dominated the First World War, a conflict in which the problem of breaking through heavily fortified defensive lines had consumed the strategic thinking of every major power for 4 years and had cost millions of lives without producing a satisfactory solution, and the French military establishment that emerged from that war was deeply and understandably shaped by the experience of fighting in the trenches, of watching attack after attack founder against barbed wire and machine guns and carefully prepared defensive positions that seemed to absorb any amount of offensive effort without yielding anything of strategic value. The tank had appeared during the First World War as a potential solution to this problem, and the French had been among the earliest and most enthusiastic adopters of the concept. But the tanks available during the war were small, unreliable, and mechanically primitive enough that their tactical impact, while real, was limited by the technology of the time rather than by the soundness of the basic concept, and French military planners believed that what was needed was not simply more tanks, but a fundamentally different kind of tank, larger and more powerful and more heavily armored than anything that had been built before. A rolling fortress that could simply drive through any defensive position that the enemy could construct. The design process for what would become the Char 2C began in 1916 and continued through the end of the war and beyond, absorbing an enormous amount of engineering effort and evolving through multiple iterations as designers tried to reconcile the competing demands of firepower, protection, and mobility in a vehicle that was supposed to be able to do things that no tank had ever done before. The final design that emerged from this process was extraordinary by any standard. A vehicle approximately 10 meters long and 3 meters tall that weighed between 69 and 75 tons, depending on the configuration, carried a crew of 12 men, mounted a 75-millimeter gun in a forward turret, and a 37-millimeter gun in a rear turret along with multiple machine guns, and was powered by 2 separate engines that drove the tracks independently and required their own dedicated crew members to operate and maintain during combat. The vehicle was so long that it had to be articulated, with the rear section able to flex relative to the front section to allow it to navigate the kind of broken terrain it was expected to encounter, which was the feature that gave it the nickname that French soldiers and later historians would use to describe it, because the way the 2 sections moved relative to each other reminded observers of the bellows of an accordion, giving the most powerful tank in the French arsenal the somewhat undignified nickname of the accordion tank. Building the Char 2C turned out to be significantly more difficult than designing it, because a vehicle of this size and complexity pushed the manufacturing capabilities of French industry in the late 1910s to their absolute limits, requiring specialized components and precision manufacturing tolerances that were difficult to achieve consistently in factories that had been focused for years on producing simpler weapons in enormous quantities. The original plan had called for building several hundred Char 2Cs, a number that would have given France a genuinely formidable heavy tank force capable of potentially decisive action on the battlefield. But the combination of manufacturing difficulties, enormous cost, and the end of the war in November 1918 resulted in the program being drastically scaled back, and when the production run was finally complete, France had exactly 10 Char 2Cs, a number that was impressive enough for propaganda purposes, but far too small to constitute a serious operational force capable of independent action on a modern battlefield. The 10 Char 2Cs were organized into a single unit, the 51st Battalion of Combat Tanks, and for most of the interwar period, they served a purpose that was more symbolic than military, appearing at parades and public demonstrations where their enormous size and impressive appearance made them extremely effective tools of national propaganda, communicating to both French citizens and potential enemies that France possessed military technology of the highest order, and that any country contemplating aggressive action against French interests would have to reckon with machines of extraordinary power. The Char 2C was photographed extensively, written about admiringly in military journals, and presented to the public as evidence that French military technology was among the most advanced in the world, and in the narrow sense that they were the largest tanks ever built and among the most heavily armed vehicles of their era. These claims were not entirely without foundation. What the propaganda did not mention, and what the military establishment was perhaps not fully honest with itself about, was the extent to which the Char 2C was a solution to a problem that no longer existed in the form it had taken during the First World War, because the battlefield of the late 1930s and early 1940s was fundamentally different from the static trench warfare environment that the tank had been designed to operate in, and the characteristics that made the Char 2C impressive as a trench-crossing fortress made it deeply problematic as a weapon in a war of movement. The vehicle's maximum speed was approximately 12 kilometers per hour on a good road, which meant that it was too slow to keep up with the pace of operations that modern warfare demanded, and its enormous size made it dependent on bridges and roads that could support its weight, severely limiting the routes it could use and making its movements predictable to any enemy who understood its limitations. The mechanical complexity of a vehicle with 2 separate engines and 12 crew members meant that keeping the Char 2Cs operational required a disproportionate maintenance effort, and by the late 1930s, some of the vehicles were in poor mechanical condition after years of service, without the complete rebuilds that vehicles of their complexity periodically required. When Germany invaded France in May 1940, with an operational concept built around speed, surprise, and the exploitation of gaps in the French defensive line, rather than the frontal assault on prepared positions that French planners had been preparing to repel, the entire French military system was caught in a state of conceptual unreadiness that went far deeper than simple tactical surprise, because the French had spent the interwar years preparing for a war that looked like the First World War, and found themselves fighting a war that looked like nothing they had planned for. The Char 2Cs were mobilized as part of the French response to the German invasion and were loaded onto railway flat cars for transport to the front, which was the only practical way to move vehicles of their size and weight over any significant distance. But the speed of the German advance and the disruption it caused to French logistics and communications meant that the trains carrying the Char 2Cs never reached their destinations. The specific circumstances in which the Char 2Cs met their end varied somewhat from vehicle to vehicle, but the common thread running through all of them was the same fundamental absurdity, that the most powerful tanks in the French arsenal were destroyed not in battle, but in a series of chaotic and inglorious episodes in which crews abandoned or demolished their vehicles to prevent capture, unable to get them to the front because the front had moved too fast for a 10-meter, 70-ton vehicle on a railway flat car to keep up with. One of the vehicles was destroyed when its train was captured by German forces. Several others were demolished by their own crews when it became clear that they could not be moved to safety, and the entire episode lasted such a short time and involved such a complete absence of actual combat that the Char 2C managed the remarkable distinction of being the largest tank ever built, and also one of the least militarily significant, a vehicle whose operational career consisted almost entirely of being transported toward battles it never reached, and then being destroyed to prevent it from being useful to the enemy. The Germans, to their credit, recognized good propaganda when they captured it, and the images of captured or destroyed Char 2Cs were used extensively in German propaganda to illustrate the completeness of the French defeat and the helplessness of even France's most powerful weapons in the face of German military efficiency, which added a final layer of humiliation to a story that was already comprehensively embarrassing for the French military establishment. The tank that had been used for years as a symbol of French military power became, in the space of a few weeks in May and June 1940, a symbol of exactly the opposite, of military thinking so thoroughly oriented toward the past that it had produced weapons perfectly optimized for a war that was never going to happen again. The story of the Char 2C is not simply a story about a bad tank, because in many respects the Char 2C was not a bad tank in the narrow technical sense of the term. Its armor was thick, its gun was powerful, and the engineering that went into building it was genuinely impressive for its era. It is a story about a bad idea executed with great competence, about what happens when military planners become so committed to a particular vision of future warfare that they cannot update that vision when the evidence begins to suggest that the future is going to look different from what they imagined, and about the specific and recurring military sin of building weapons for the last war rather than the next one. The Accordion tank, the largest tank ever built, the pride of the French heavy tank force, surrendered without firing a shot, not because it was weak, but because the war it was built for had already ended. 20 years before the war it was supposed to fight began, and no amount of engineering excellence or propaganda value could bridge that fundamental gap between conception and reality.